but rather to shift the discourse in the Muslim community from issues that were less relevant, less pressing, to issues that were profoundly relevant and that we would not be able to avoid as we move forward as a community. Now, Jones himself, following his critique, put forth his own solution to the problem. Jones argued that traditional notions of omnipotence had to go. And to a certain degree, traditional notions even of omnibenevolence had to be severely modified. But we could not hold on to these traditional notions. And in their place, he proposed what he called a humano-centric theism. I'll say that word again. A humano-centric theism. Now, in point of fact, this was actually Jones's sort of compromise, because he himself says that he personally has a preference for a sort of secular humanism. But that theistic thinking was so entrenched in the black community that it would not be really feasible to expect to be able to move the black community out of this theistic universe. Humanocentric theism basically says the following: human beings are the masters of history, whereas traditional omnipotence held God to be the God of nature and of history. Jones argued that humanocentric theism argues that while God may be the God of nature, God is not the God of history. Rather, human beings, independent of God, are the masters of their history. That we are not dependent on God to make or unmake history. And therefore, human suffering, that is moral suffering, not metaphysical suffering. I think Dr. Umar referred to it as volitional versus non-volitional suffering. I mean, the suffering that humans inflict upon other humans. Genocide, slavery, etc. Jones argued, in order for humans to eradicate that, they don't need God. They have all they need in and of themselves. This was his means of doing two things. One, absolving God, and part of his point was, if you want to absolve God of the divine racism charge, you have to negate God's sovereignty over history. Second, if humans have the independent capacity to make their own history, then they no longer are stuck with an ethic of quietism. Because to revolt against suffering is not to revolt against God. It is to revolt against other human beings. Second, with regard to omnibenevolence, only by maintaining that God was only the God of nature could God's omnibenevolence be preserved. And so Jones argued that only if we are willing to make these adjustments to traditional notions of omnipotence and omnibenevolence could we have it. Wow. Could we have a chance? You're not serious. You are. This is my introduction. All right. Wow. Okay. So this was Jones's argument. Now my project, can I stand up? Because I have to turn into the academic here. Can I? See all that? my project was essentially the following. As I said before, Muslim theology was not and is not a monolith. There are 3 to 4 schools of Muslim theology that have come down to us in modern times and that are still subscribed to by Muslims. And so my project was to put Jones's critique in conversation with the 4 main traditional schools of Muslim theology. And that means that we would come out not necessarily with one answer, but perhaps with a multiplicity of answers. And again, the goal is to see how Islam, or Muslim theology, would fare in the context of Jones's critique. So the first school was a school known as the Mu'tazilite school. The Mu'tazilite school. And part of why I'm going through this exercise is that I think it's important both for Muslims in America and for America as a whole to get more used to this pluralistic reality of Islam. Instead of always thinking about, well, what does Islam, as if it's a black box with one answer for all things, say about this? All right? Now, 10 minutes? All right. Whew. Okay, you're going to get the real condensed version. I thought I would have more time. I apologize about that. Okay. The Mu'tazilites are actually the closest of the early schools of theology to Jones. They are a school that essentially argued that God is the master of nature, but he is not the master of history. And this implicated the very prominence of the doctrine of free will in Mu'tazilite theology. But here we have to be careful, because the Mu'tazilites subscribe to a notion of free will precisely for the purpose of exonerating God of responsibility for human on human suffering. But this free will needs to be understood properly, because all of the other schools opposed the Mu'tazilites on this doctrine. All of them. They said the Mu'tazilites are wrong. And this has led many people to think, to say, even scholars to write, that the other schools of theology in Islam don't believe in free will. Right? That's actually not right. It's false. The Mu'tazilite free will was bidimensional. They meant that humans have what? Both choice and the power or agency independently to translate those choices into reality. Anybody follow what I mean by that? I'll give you a joke. Five birds sitting on a stoop. 3 of them decide to fly away. How many birds still on the stoop? Wrong, 5. Does everybody see the difference now? A decision, a choice to fly away is not the same as flying away. Does everybody understand that? The Mu'tazilites were arguing that human beings had both independent choice and independent power. Now that power originally came from God. But the Mu'tazilites argued that God handed that power entirely over to human beings as their own private entity. Does anybody understand what I mean by that? Could you take that second? Now, does anybody follow what I mean by that? With that power that has been handed over to them as a sort of power pack, right? They no longer need God in order to act. Anybody follow what I mean by that? They were not atheistic in the slightest, and the Mu'tazilites were very committed Muslims. Their theology, however, said that God had handed this power over to humans, right? And on the basis of that power, humans could act freely. Now, the Mu'tazilites were very keen on denying that God was in any way responsible for moral evil. And here's a little detail that I think that is relevant to us. One of the things about the Mu'tazilites is that they arose in the context of societies. George Harani has written much on this. Many people trace their origins back to the Greeks, but he argues no, they were much more influenced by Zoroastrians. And Zoroastrians had a very easy solution for the problem of evil. It was the product of the God of evil. Right? There's God of good, God of evil. Well, we can explain all evil that way. And so they come to the Muslims and say, but you say there's one God, and he has power over all things. How do you explain evil then? And so the Mu'tazilites developed that notion. Now, this goes along quite well with Jones. The Mu'tazilites are arguing that God is the God of nature, but not of history. Humans are responsible for the suffering they inflict upon other humans. As a result, humans can revolt against that suffering without revolting against God. All right? And in that way, quietism is avoided. All right? Now, the next school, maybe I should. The next school was the Ash'arite school. But I want to go back to the Mu'tazilites. Oh, that's all right. How many people, some of you who know me are going to laugh at this. How many people saw the movie I Am Legend? I know Muslims don't watch movies, but that's not ish. In I Am Legend, there is a scene where everything seems to be gone to hell, right? And Will Smith stands out in the middle of the street and says, what? No. No. He says what? There is no God. Remember that scene? There is no God. What did he mean by that? He meant that if there is a God, and that God is all good, and that's a general presumption we have about God, then this wouldn't happen. And because this is happening, there can't be any God. Right? This is consistent with the Mu'tazilite frame of mind. For them, divine justice and goodness was everything. That was their chief characteristic of God. God is either all good or he's not God. And their theology, everything you see here, essentially follows from that basic premise. All right? Now, when we turn to the Ash'arites, they privilege the divine power. Now, the Ash'arites are not arguing that God is not good. They are responding to the Mu'tazilites. And part of their concern is that the Mu'tazilites are proceeding in a manner that assumes that our human judgments of what is good and what is not can be superimposed upon God. That we, based on how something affects us, can set up a standard by which we judge God. The Ash'arites opposed this. And they argued that God's chief characteristic is his qudra, or his power, and that God has power over all things. Nothing comes into existence without God's power. And this is one of the reasons why they oppose the Mu'tazilites on what? Free will. All right? But what the Ash'arites opposed was not freedom of choice primarily. Everybody follow that? Not freedom of choice. And these notions that, there were some early schools that argued for outright what came to call predestination, that we are just like blades of grass in the wind, and we only do what God, right? No established school of Muslim theology held that. None of them, right? The Ash'arites held that we have free choice, but not entirely free power. Now let me give you an example of what I'm talking about. Those of you who are writing notes right now, not on computers, by hand. I'm a technophobe. I want you to draw a line straight across your page. No, hold up. Straight. I mean straight. All right? Straight. Got it? Draw it? All right. Now look at the line. How straight is it? You follow what I'm saying? Now you chose to do what? Everybody follow? You chose to draw a straight line. Somehow it did not come out the way you chose. Right? That's what the Ash'arites are essentially arguing, that the power that you have to translate those choices into reality, all right, are not consistent with your choices. They come from God, okay? And here's going to get a little bit technical, and they can handle it. I'm very impressed, by the way, I have to say as a footnote, all these people on a Tuesday night for theology? That's impressive. The Ash'arites argued that this power comes to us not as this, anybody follow what I mean by that? But on occasion of our willing. This is known as the famous doctrine of Kesb. When I will, at the instant that I will, God dispenses the power and I act. Right? In that way, I am in some ways the first cause of my action. But my action does not come to constitute an action unless what? Unless what? Okay. So if I snatch your phone right now, that's an evil act, is it not? Is it not? Okay. Is God responsible for it? No. Wow. What they would argue is that I am responsible for it. All God did was what? Give me the power, all right, to translate that choice into action. And if God had not dispensed that power, what? Okay? In this way, I remain responsible for what? For the evil. Humans remain responsible for the evil. And yet, ultimately, it does not occur outside of God's power. Does everybody understand? Because what the Asherites did not like was this idea that through this kind of will, God could will something, and I could actually oppose it. God could will against something, and I could actually what? That for them meant God was not omnipotent. Okay? Now, very quickly, because I think I'm running out of time, right? I'm out of time. All right, very, very quickly. There are two other schools, and I just want to say a word about them. The Maturidite school, and by the way, you can buy the book. That was a pretty nice trick, huh? The Maturidite school. The Maturidite school was a lot like the Escherite school. They also subscribed to a version of Kesp. But I really do want to say something here. When we talk about Muslim schools of theology, we're used to, this monotone. So, right? Monotone. That's not how Muslim theology worked. Within the Asherite school, you will find Asherites who differ with each other on this nuance, on that nuance. Islam was a rich civilization. This is one of the tragedies that has befallen Muslims in modern times. Not only has the pluralism gone, they are very uncomfortable with it. All right? These guys did it. All right? And that was a part of what Islam was. So you'll find Asharis who, Baqilani and others, Qarabisi and others, they have their nuances. All right? In the same way, the Maturidites have their nuances on this kesp, all right? Occasionalistic power dispensed from God. But the Maturidites, they differ from the Asherites in this chief characteristic. The Mu'tazilites said God's chief characteristic is what? Justice and goodness. The Asherites said God's chief characteristic is what? Power. The Maturidites said God's chief characteristic is wisdom. All right? Now the Mu'tazilites argued that God cannot do evil. That's why humans have free will. The Asherites, or the most prominent school among Asherites, also argued that God cannot do evil, but not in the sense that God can't do things that you might count as evil, or that I may count as evil. God can't do evil because the entire universe belongs to God, and there is no one who can sit in judgment of God. Does anybody understand what I mean by that? All right? If I rip my own jacket, well, it's my jacket, right? That's what the Asherites would argue. The Maturidites, on the other hand, said no. And they're very unique in this regard. The Maturidites argue actually that God can commit evil. In fact, Maturidi himself, the founder of the Maturidite school, Maturidi himself has a very interesting argument. He argues, in fact, that the existence of evil is one of the proofs of the existence of God. Why? Because if the universe had brought itself into existence, it would only have produced that which is consistent with its own sustenance. Somebody follow what I mean by that? It would only have produced that which is consistent with its own longevity. The fact of evil suggests that something outside the universe must have brought it into existence. All right? Now, they're not quietistic on human suffering. That's not the point. What they argue is that while God may either produce or allow evil, what he cannot do is produce or allow evil that does not serve some wise purpose. And I don't have time now to go into the Maturidites, but let me just say this. Theirs is a very powerful doctrine, and it's one of the things that, you know, it militates against this sort of modern tendency towards entitlement that we have. They are very explicit in that many things that we don't like, all right, may be good for us. Most of us, and I'll end it here, just say a little word about tradition, I'll end it here. I see Rami's getting nervous, it's making me nervous. What the Maturidites are essentially saying is this: even in terms of black suffering, okay, all right, there is a potential good that comes out of it, all right? And they don't argue that they should accept black suffering. No, the Maturidites say, no, you must oppose that suffering. However, you know, before he died, Martin King had reservations about, you know, he felt that I might be breaking into a burning building. And